I had the slightly depressing experience recently. I'm not sure whether you've done this, of going to Google Scholar and searching, in inverted commas, as an AI language model, or some other similar thing, right? And just seeing the sheer volume of papers that have passed so-called peer review in so-called prestigious journals that are just obviously not human written, with no indication of that fact. And there are obviously plenty of examples. I forget what the Sokol affair and other things where
right.
This process that on the surface sounds like a very reasonable idea. This the idea that you claim some new result, you get people who know the field to kind of say yes, that's a reasonable result, or no, this is not quite right. That's a perfectly reasonable model. It's just not what peer review actually is in practice. It's important to remember as well that, in a sense, the modern system of scientific publishing, and indeed the modern system of academia, was not really designed, right? Like no one sat down and said, this is how we should do science. It just kind of happened, right? This model of scientific journals and peer review and editors and so on, you can trace that back to a direct extension of these early proto-journals, like the Transactions of the Royal Society, which, if you go back and look at them, were very different to modern scientific journals, right? It's always kind of entertaining when you go and read submissions to the Transactions of the Royal Society that were made by Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton and so on, because they basically read like blog posts. They're actually very, very informal. They you have these guys, they just go in, they say, oh, I did this, I did that, I mixed this chemical with this, and I saw this thing, and then my cat knocked my experiment over, and whatever. And it's very conversational, it's very discursive. And yes, it was reviewed, but the review process was much less formalized than it is. And I'm not saying that something like that could work today. I mean, science is much more sort of industrialized and so on. You clearly need some kind of more systematic way of processing the volume of scientific literature that's being produced. But still, it's pretty evident that there was never any person who said this is a good model for scientific research and dissemination, this is how it should be done. It just it naturally evolved from a system that really wasn't set up to accommodate what it's become. Another important thing to remember is that the notion of scientific publishing and the notion of peer review served a pair of purposes which in the modern world have essentially become distinct. So it used to be that journal publishers served two roles. They were there for quality control because of peer review, and they were there for dissemination because they actually printed the physical manuscripts that got sent to libraries and things. In the modern era, with things like archive and sci-archive and bioarchive and generally preprint servers and people able to host papers on their website, dissemination, which was always the expensive part of journal publishing, we don't need that anymore, right? We've got that covered.
So peer review is for quality control.
So yes, exactly. So the real role for journals now is quality control, in my opinion. And the issue with that is that's incredibly cheap because I review papers as does every other academic, and we do it for free. We do it because it's kind of public service and whatever, and it's an important thing to do. So we don't get paid. The people writing the papers don't get paid. The journals shouldn't need to spend lots of money to print physical copies. So really, journal publication should be not quite free, but basically incredibly cheap. And it's not, right? And the reason is because, as I say, you have these journals who are essentially kind of holding on to this very outmoded model where they're pushing the dissemination part I would argue, at the expense of the quality control part. And so that's why I've been a great advocate. There are these new kinds of journals that are coming out. There's one called Discrete Analysis and a few others that are these so-called archive overlay journals, which I think are a fantastic idea. Where the idea is we say the content itself is going to be hosted on the archive preprint server. So we don't need to care about dissemination. So that's all incredibly cheap. We just literally post a link to an archive paper. And so all we're going to do is worry about the quality control. And then once you start to think about that, and once you're not bound to having physical copies that have to go to printers and things, you can actually do peer review in a very different, and I would argue much more productive way. You can have things like open post-publication peer review, where rather than pre-publication, the manuscript gets sent to some anonymous reviewers and then they spend 6 months deliberating and they get the result back and no one ever sees it. You can have something where someone posts a preprint on archive, it goes on an open review site, and then anyone in that area or anyone outside the area can come in and say, I don't understand this, or this doesn't make sense, or, oh, this is a great paper, or whatever. And then you can kind of upvote, downvote. You can say, oh, yeah, I agree with your criticism, and etc. And the whole thing can be open and de-anonymized.
And it would have to be anonymized by the person who's posting it up there, because otherwise, if people see that Ed Witten posted something, more eyes will go toward that. But you can also, if you're in the field, you can discern sometimes who's publishing what.
Yeah, absolutely. And in certainly in math and physics, in these places where, and computer science, in places where, in those fields, it's been standard for many decades now, for several decades, that everyone posts their work on archive, right? And they post their work on archive typically before or possibly simultaneously with submitting their work to a journal. So if you get, even if the journal, so because of that, physics journals, journals like JHEP or Classical Quantum Gravity, etc., they don't even try and anonymize their manuscripts, because they know if they anonymized it, you could just Google the first sentence and go find the archive paper and see you posted it. So yes, I think, double-blind peer review, etc., made sense in a particular era to eliminate exactly the kinds of biases that you're characterizing and other ones. But for math and physics, where the workflow is you put your paper on archive and then maybe a couple of weeks later you submit it to a journal, it doesn't make sense at all. And so people don't even try.
So about the journal's inflated prices, outside of an oligarchy or collusion, what's keeping it high?
I'm reticent to claim that it's a collusion. So, a lot of it is just that a lot of it is tied into the promotion structure in academia, right? So a lot of it is tied into, if you want to get a permanent job in academia, if you want to advance up that ladder, you need to get, there's this general view that you need to get published in the fancy journals. And then that means that the journals that are generally perceived by university administrators as being the fancy ones know that they can charge essentially arbitrarily high prices, and people will pay them because their livelihoods depend on it.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's a really quite sordid situation when you think about it.
I saw a talk recently by someone who's going into the academic world saying that some of the applications for professorship or postdocship, that the second question after what is your name is how many citations do you have? And then people try to game this because you can publish something that is just worthy of publication and do that many times rather than produce something that you feel like is of high quality, but will get less citations than if you were to split that up. And then you just flood the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are these metrics, there are these author level metrics like the H index and so on, which measure, so H index equals N means that you have N papers that have been cited at least N times. And that gets used actually quite frequently in hiring committees and tenure committees and things like that. And yeah, it's incredibly easy to game, right? It's this classic Goodhart's law example where, as soon as you know that you're being measured on that criterion, you can then say, oh, I'm going to just cite myself in all, in every future paper I'm going to write, I'm going to cite myself in all previous ones. And then I can very easily get some kind of N squared dependence on my H index. And then I can get my friends to cite me too. And I can, as you say, rather than investing a year to write this one really good, polished, definitive paper on this subject, I'm going to write 10 like salami sliced mini, minimum publishable unit things.
Yeah, right. That's a great way of saying it.
Right. And all of that happens, right? And it requires, and I'm guilty of some of that too. Not because I want to be, but because I need. I live in the academic system. That's kind of how one has to operate to a certain extent. If you're competing with other people who are doing that, it's awful, right? And I don't want to be in that situation. And if given the choice, I always try to be someone who, if I'm going to invest the time to write a paper on something, I want to write, in as much as possible, the definitive paper on that thing and have it clean and polished and something that I'm proud of. But I think it's my impression, at least, is that it's becoming increasingly hard for that to be a viable career strategy.
Yeah, what's fortunate in your case is that you were employed by Wolfram for some time, and so you were able to work on the ideas that were interesting to you and not have to concern yourself. Or maybe I'm incorrect, but at least from my perspective, you didn't have to concern yourself with incremental publications on ideas that aren't innovative in order for you to build the credit to your name. But maybe I'm incorrect.
Well, there was certainly an element of that, right? So during the time I was employed at Wolfram, I also was, initially I was a graduate student, or actually very early stages I was an undergraduate, then I was a graduate student, and then I was a kind of junior academic. So I still had some academic position during that time. And for that reason, it wasn't something I could completely ignore, right?
Yes.
Because, that would have been kind of irresponsible from a career standpoint. But yes, in a way, it did take the pressure off, because it meant that I had a kind of more or less guaranteed funding source for at least part of my research and I wasn't having to repeatedly kind of beg, government funding agencies for more money and things and show them long lists of papers. It was also useful in a different way, which is that it meant that the stuff I was doing got much more exposure than it would have done otherwise. I mean, we wouldn't have met, if it hadn't been for Stephen, right? And the kind of the additional, both the additional cachet and the additional flack that is associated with, with having his name attached to the project. And so, in a way, it meant that there was, for my level in the academic hierarchy, my work ended up being significantly overexposed. And that was good in a way. It was bad in another way.
Why would it be bad?
Well, it meant that so one negative aspect of it, which has not been hugely problematic, but is, Stephen has a certain reputation, right? And that reputation is positive in many ways and negative in many other ways. And by, if you are billed as, you are the person, you are the other person or one of the other people working on the Wolfram Physics project, you get, there's a sense in which you're elevated by association and you get tainted by association. Okay. And people assume that, people assume that many of the negative characteristics associated with, not giving appropriate credit to prior sources or, having slightly inflated ego issues, etc. Right? Many of those things kind of get projected on you, rightly or wrongly, by virtue of association.
Yeah, or that you're supporting that. So maybe you don't have those qualities.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And it's a difficult thing to I mean, in a way, it helped because it meant that a lot of the criticism of the project got leveled at Stephen, not at kind of the rest of us, right?
Yes.
So in a way, it was useful, but in other senses, it was it's a delicate balance.
So how do you see academics' engagement with the ideas from the Wolfram Physics project?
Yeah, it's been mixed, very mixed. So on the kind of traditional fundamental physics people, it's mostly been, ignored, right? So, like, if you look at your average string theorist, many of them will have, or you talk to them, many of them will have heard of the project and will say, oh, that's that weird kooky thing that guy did, and we don't really know anything about it, right? That's the general response that I've seen.
They'll say they scrolled through the blog post, but then didn't find anything readily applicable to their field, and so they're just waiting for it to produce results. That's the general statement.
Right, exactly.
Yes, and then they'll say,
precisely.
The necessary, well, I wish him luck, but firstly, I don't think they actually mean that. Secondly, if they do, they only mean that because they're not competing for the same dollars.
Yes. And I've certainly had conversations with people who are not quite so polite. But yes. So there's that crowd. There are some people in the quantum gravity community who have actually taken some interest and have started, have cited our work and have used it, and it's been incorporated in other things. So causal set theory is one example that's a slightly unconventional branch to approach to quantum gravity that's really quite formalistically similar. In a way, causal sets are really just, they're partially ordered sets. They're really the same as causal graphs in some sense. And so there's a precise sense in which you can say that the hypergraph rewriting formalism is just giving you a dynamics for causal set theory, which causal set theory does not possess a priori because it's essentially a kinematic theory. And so, in those communities, it's been somewhat more receptive. There's been, there are in areas, this is essentially unsurprising, right? So in areas where there is formalistic similarity, like say loop quantum gravity, where there's some similarity in the setup of things like spin networks and spin foams, there's been some interest in these kind of topological quantum field theory models or topological quantum computing models, where again, there's interest in this intersection between, combinatorial structure, topology, etc., and fundamental physics. There's been some interest. An area where we've got a lot of interest is in applied category theory. So, people who, I would say that's been, at least in terms of the stuff that I've worked on, that's been by far our kind of most warm reception, are people working on categorical quantum mechanics, and particularly these kind of diagrammatic graph rewriting approaches to quantum mechanics like ZX calculus and so on. We've had some very, very productive interactions with that crowd, and also with people not directly on the physics side, but interested in the formalism for other reasons. So there are people like the algebraic graph rewriting crowd, many of whom are in areas like Paris and Scotland, who again, have been very interested in what we've been doing. Not necessarily for physics reasons, but because they're interested in the algebraic structure of how we're setting things up, or they're interested in how the formalism can be applied to other things like chemical reaction networks or distributed computing and that kind of stuff.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're hungry for deeper dives into physics, AI, consciousness, philosophy, along with my personal reflections, you'll find it all on my Substack. Subscribers get first access to new episodes, new posts as well, behind-the-scenes insights, and the chance to be a part of a thriving community of like-minded pilgrimers. By joining, you'll directly be supporting my work and helping keep these conversations at the cutting edge. So click the link on screen here, hit subscribe, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge together. Thank you and enjoy the show. Just so you know, if you're listening, it's CurtJaimungal.org, CurtJaimungal.org.